Greetings, Bib 1001 from Michigan once again. This is for our Tuesday lectures, which won't be able to Zoom with you, be at my father-in-law's funeral. Thank you again for your prayers, and he passed very peacefully, and my wife and her sisters were able to basically sing him into heaven. And so just really appreciate your prayers and your understanding. Hopefully next week get back into a regular rhythm of Zooming on Tuesdays and then video lectures on Thursdays. I will set up some office hours on Zoom, so be watching for that. In this video, what I want us to do is take a look at Exodus chapter 1. So we are going to move from Abraham all the way to Exodus. We're not going to cover the story of Isaac and Rebekah, and then Jacob and Esau, and Jacob and his 4 wives and 12 sons, and Joseph, and how they ended up down in Egypt. I'm trusting that you've read all of that and read about that. I encourage you to do so. But we're going to go ahead and just jump to Exodus chapter 1. If you have questions about any of the stuff from Genesis 23 through 50, feel free to email me, or we can talk about that in an office hour Zoom session. So I'm going to share the screen with you at this point and take us to Exodus chapter 1. And so here we go. And this is from the ESV. And I'll just read through it. I know you can read, but I'll read through it and kind of comment along the way. So these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now you notice I highlighted that verse. And the reason I highlighted it is because it has to do with the promise. Remember the promise that God made to Abraham of children and God's presence with him and them and of the land. And so the rest of Genesis has really been focused on the establishment of this family. Would Isaac have children? And then the blessing went to Jacob. And would Jacob have a family and children? And we had the 12 sons. And now they're down in Egypt. And as they came down, they numbered 70 persons in all. And so the family looks like it's going to take root and be established. And we get to verse 7 and we discover that they're fruitful and that they've multiplied, that the whole land was filled with them. And so the narrator expects us to realize, wow, God kept his promise of children to Abraham. And so highlight that. Realize the narrator is not going to tell you God kept his promise. The narrator expects you to connect the dots. And so right here, what we're seeing is the faithfulness of God in keeping his promise to Abraham of children, of offspring. The land of Egypt is basically teeming with Abraham's children. We go on. Now there was a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Now, I know you get this. The basic thing is that they're multiplying, but they're being forced into slavery, and they're being worked ruthlessly. Do you remember the second part of the promise? God's presence. And so what we have here are events that really kind of call into question, is God with them? I mean, yes, they multiplied, but now they're being worked ruthlessly as slaves, and their life is bitter because of the hard slavery. And so it really does raise the question, is God with them? Now, I know you could kind of flip it around and think, well, God must be with them. They're multiplying. Here they are being worked ruthlessly, and yet they are multiplying. And so God must be with them. But if you're in the midst of it, it would really raise the question, God, where is your presence? And God, what about that word, that promise that if anyone dishonors me, anyone dishonors us, you will curse them? And so God's promise, the second part of it, of presence, is really being called into question here. And really, it has been said that this is what the whole book of Exodus is about. It's about the presence of God. Is God with them in their slavery? Is God with them to rescue them? Is God with them when they're in the wilderness complaining about not having anything? Complaining to God about not taking care of them? Is God with them when they sin and they build the golden calf in Exodus 32? And by the time we get to the end of Exodus, we will see, yes, God is determined to be with them, and God has them build a tabernacle, and God moves in and dwells in their midst. But right here, chapter 1, we're seeing that first big issue of presence. They're being oppressed and worked ruthlessly. Is God with them? We go on to the last paragraph of chapter 1. Things get worse. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. See, I highlighted that because of their fear, their regard. They worshiped God ahead of the Pharaoh. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. I think they flat out lied. So God dealt well with the midwives, not because they lied, but he dealt well with the midwives because they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. And the people multiplied and grew very strong. Because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. God honored them. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So we go from this family being established and multiplying to now this family is basically under a death sentence from Pharaoh, that every Hebrew boy is to be, that when they're born, they are to be thrown, cast into the Nile. And so it's pretty bleak. And again, the question, God, where are you? Is God present? How can this be going on? Yes, he kept the promise of children. They are far from the land, and they're not going to make it out of Egypt unless God is with them. So that becomes the big question. Okay, I will stop this one, and we are going to move in our next video into chapter 2. So see you soon.